5 years later, Amelia, and you're still standing in the gutter where I left you. I see somebody finally decided you were worth keeping.
Horns blared. Wipers slapped against windshields in a steady, angry rhythm. And underneath the glass awning of a 50-story office tower on Park Avenue, Amelia Carter stood with one hand pressed against her belly, waiting for her car. She was 7 months pregnant. Her feet ached. Her back ached. But she was smiling, because in 20 minutes she had a doctor's appointment. And after that, dinner with her husband. Then a black Bentley rounded the corner too fast. It aimed straight for the flooded gutter in front of her. Would you forgive the person who humiliated you if one day they had to beg you for everything? That's the question at the center of this story. Because somewhere between a puddle of dirty rainwater and a $10 billion business deal, one man was about to discover that the woman he mocked held his entire future in her hands. Stay with me, because what happens in the next few minutes will make you believe that karma doesn't just exist. Sometimes it drives a Bentley. If you love stories about quiet people who turn out to be the most powerful person in the room, hit subscribe now, drop a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. You're going to want to be here for the ending. The Bentley's driver saw Amelia. He eased off the gas. But the man in the back seat saw her too. He leaned forward. "Keep going," he said. The driver hesitated, then obeyed. The car tore through the puddle at full speed. A wall of filthy water rose into the air and crashed over Amelia before she could even turn away. It soaked her coat, her hair, her hands, still pressed protectively over her stomach. She gasped. Cold water ran down her collar. A woman nearby cried out in shock. A man rushed to hand her his jacket, but Amelia was frozen, blinking water out her eyes, feeling it seep through to her skin. The Bentley stopped at the curb. The rear window slid down. Ethan Cole looked out at her, and he was smiling. Amelia's stomach didn't just turn from the cold. It turned because she knew that face. She'd loved that face once. She'd built a company with that face. She'd shared a bed, a name, and 5 years of her life with a man, now looking at her like she was something he'd scraped off his shoe. 5 years later, Amelia, Ethan said, voice dripping with amusement, "And you're still standing in the gutter where I left you." His eyes dropped to her belly, just for a second, just long enough to make his next words land like a slap. "I see somebody finally decided you were worth keeping." He didn't wait for a response. The window rose. The Bentley pulled away, tires hissing against the wet street, and within seconds it had disappeared into traffic, leaving Amelia standing there, soaked, shaking, and furious. A woman passing by slowed down. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need help?" Amelia shook her head, forcing a small, tight smile. "I'm fine. Thank you." She wasn't fine, but she would be. 30 seconds later, another car pulled up, sleek, black, quiet, the way only the most expensive things are quiet. The rear door opened, and a tall man in a charcoal suit stepped out into the rain without hesitating, without even reaching for an umbrella. Alexander Sterling. If you'd asked anyone on Wall Street to name the 10 most powerful men in American finance, his name would be on that list, even though almost nobody could describe his face. He didn't do interviews. He didn't attend galas, unless he had to. He built companies, broke companies, and quietly reshaped entire industries from behind closed doors. And he did it all without ever needing anyone to know his name. But he knew Amelia's face better than his own. The moment he saw her standing there, soaked to the bone, one hand still cradling her belly, something in his expression went cold and still, like a lake freezing over in an instant. Who did this? Amelia looked toward the empty street, where the Bentley had vanished. Ethan. Alexander's jaw tightened. He reached into his coat and pulled out his phone. I'll have him removed from the bidding process before he reaches his next traffic light. Amelia caught his wrist. No. He looked at her, and for a moment, the billionaire who never raised his voice in boardrooms, who had once ended a merger with a single sentence, looked almost helpless. He deliberately drove through a puddle to humiliate my pregnant wife. And if you destroy him for that, Amelia said quietly, wiping muddy water from her cheek, he'll spend the rest of his life telling people he was a victim, that a jealous billionaire crushed his company because of a personal grudge. Let him compete. Let him win or lose on what he actually is. Alexander studied her for a long moment. Rain dripped from his hair, down the collar of his $3,000 suit, and he didn't seem to notice or care. Finally, he put the phone away. All right. He looked toward the empty street one more time, his eyes narrowing. But if he's dirty, my people will find it. Amelia managed a tired, determined smile, then let the truth crush him. What neither of them said out loud, but both of them knew, was this. Ethan Cole had no idea who he had just humiliated. He had no idea that the woman he just mocked in the street was married to the very man whose signature he needed on a $10 billion contract. And he had no idea that the child growing inside her, the child he had just sneered at, belonged to Alexander Sterling. He was about to find out, but not yet. To understand how a woman went from a devastating divorce to marrying one of the most powerful men in the country, you have to go back 5 years, to before the Bentleys, before the marriage, before any of it. Back to when Amelia Carter and Ethan Cole were just two ambitious people trying to build something together. 5 years earlier, Amelia and Ethan started a logistics company out of a rented office above a dry cleaner in Stamford, Connecticut. It wasn't glamorous. There were nights they slept on a pull-out couch because they couldn't afford a hotel for a client meeting the next morning. Amelia ran operations. She negotiated with warehouse owners twice her age who didn't want to take a young woman seriously, and she won them over anyway, because she always came prepared, always came early, and never left a meeting without an answer to every question they threw at her. Ethan was the face. He was good at that part. Charming in rooms full of investors, quick with a joke, quick with a handshake. People liked him instantly, and for a while, Amelia liked that about him too. She told herself their partnership worked because they balanced each other out. Then the company started making real money, and Ethan started changing. It began with small things. Taking credit in meetings for ideas that weren't his. Disappearing for long stretches. He never explained. Amelia noticed, but she was drowning in 80-hour weeks, and she told herself it didn't matter as long as the company kept growing. Then she found out about the affair with her best friend, a woman named Priscilla Voss, who had been in Amelia's life since college. That betrayal alone should have been enough to end everything. But a few months later, Amelia discovered something worse. Ethan had also been involved with her younger sister. The marriage collapsed fast after that. What Amelia didn't discover until later, until it was too late, was that while their relationship was falling apart in private, Ethan had been moving company assets through a web of shell companies, quietly restructuring ownership, manipulating financial documents, so that by the time the divorce was finalized, he walked away controlling almost everything they had built together. Amelia walked away with debt, with humiliation, with a family fractured by betrayal on every side. But one person stayed. Her older brother, Daniel Carter, sat beside her through every terrible court date. He helped her find a cheap apartment when she couldn't afford anything else. He listened when she cried at 2 a.m, when she couldn't understand how the same man who'd once promised to build a life with her could dismantle everything she had with such cold precision. When Amelia eventually met Alexander Sterling years later, quietly, through a mutual business contact, Daniel was one of the only people she trusted enough to tell. He stood beside her at the small, private wedding they held at his estate in Greenwich. Just 20 guests, no photographers, no announcement in any newspaper. Amelia believed, with everything in her, that Daniel was the one person Ethan could never touch. The one relationship that had survived the wreckage untouched. She was wrong, but she wouldn't find that out yet. 5 years later, Ethan Cole looked, on paper, like a success story. His company, Cole Infrastructure Group, occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in Midtown. He drove a Bentley. He wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He'd built a reputation as a rising force in American infrastructure development, the kind of name that got mentioned at charity dinners in Palm Beach and industry panels in Scottsdale. But behind the marble lobby and the frame magazine covers, Cole Infrastructure Group was drowning. Bad investments, overextended credit lines, 2 failed expansion projects that had quietly bled the company of nearly everything it had gained in its best years. Ethan had spent so long building the appearance of success that he'd forgotten to protect the substance of it. There was only one thing that could save him now. a $10 billion infrastructure and logistics contract, financed and controlled by Sterling Global Capital. Ethan knew the name Alexander Sterling the way most people in his world did. As a reputation, a legend, a man who supposedly hadn't given a public interview in 6 years. He didn't know his face. He didn't know his habits. And he certainly didn't know that Alexander had married a woman named Amelia, kept the wedding private, and let her keep her professional surname, so that no one, least of all Ethan, would ever connect the dots. The pregnancy hadn't been announced anywhere either. Amelia had made sure of that. She'd spent 5 years rebuilding her life quietly, deliberately, away from anyone who might try to use her name against her. She didn't know yet that someone already was. Late one evening, in a dim corner of a private club in Manhattan, an envelope changed hands. A phone screen lit up in the dark, half hidden beneath the table. A message appeared. She still trusts me. Ethan's thumbs moved quickly over his own screen. Make sure she keeps trusting you. The identity of the person on the other end of that message stayed hidden, tucked in shadow, unseen by anyone who might have recognized the danger sitting quietly inside Amelia's own circle. Whoever it was, they had access, they had history, and they had a reason, one Amelia would never have guessed, to help the man who destroyed her sell her out all over again. The following afternoon, Ethan arrived at the Sterling Global Capital building for what he believed was a routine early stage meeting. 60 floors up, glass walls looked out over the entire island, rain from the day before still streaking faintly down the windows. He straightened his tie in the elevator mirror, ran a hand through his hair, and rehearsed the opening lines of his pitch under his breath. Confidence, charm, the same tools that had carried him this far. Then the elevator doors opened, and he saw her. Amelia stood near the reception desk in an elegant navy maternity dress, her hair dry now, pulled back, her composure completely restored. If she hadn't been drenched in gutter water 24 hours earlier, he might not have looked twice. But he had seen her yesterday, and here she was again. Ethan's mouth curled into a smirk. Following me now? Amelia didn't answer. Before she could, the doors to the executive suite opened, and every person in the waiting area rose to their feet at once, the way rooms do when someone with real power walks in. Alexander Sterling entered. Ethan straightened his jacket instinctively, the way you do in front of someone whose signature could change your life. But Alexander didn't look at Ethan. He walked straight past him, across the room, and stopped in front of Amelia. He placed one hand gently against the small of her back. "How are you feeling?" "We're fine," Amelia said softly. Alexander's hand moved, just for a moment, resting against the curve of her belly. Then he leaned down and kissed her unhurried, the way a man kisses his wife when he isn't thinking about who's watching. Ethan's face went blank. Alexander straightened, turned toward the room full of executives, lawyers, and advisors who had gathered for the meeting, and spoke in a calm, even voice that somehow carried to every corner of the space. "I believe some of you haven't met my wife, Amelia." Silence dropped over the room like a curtain. Ethan stared at Amelia, then at Alexander, then slowly at the curve of her pregnant belly, doing the math in real time, watching every piece of the last 24 hours rearrange itself into something monstrous. The woman he had splashed with muddy water in the street. The woman he had mocked for being kept by someone. The child he had glanced at with contempt. That child belonged to the one man on earth who controlled whether Coal Infrastructure Group survived the next fiscal quarter or collapsed into bankruptcy. Alexander finally turned his eyes to Ethan. His voice stayed calm, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "Mr. Cole, I believe we've already heard something about you today." Ethan opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Amelia stepped in before the silence could stretch any further. "Alexander, fair process." Alexander held Ethan's gaze a moment longer, long enough for Ethan to feel it in his chest like a closing fist. "Of course." Then, quieter, colder, in a tone that made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. A very thorough one. He turned and walked toward the conference room, his hand briefly resting again on Amelia's back as she followed him inside. Ethan stood frozen near the reception desk, his pitch, his confidence, every rehearsed line evaporating from his mind. $10 billion. His entire company. His entire future. All of it now sat in the hands of a man whose wife he had personally, deliberately humiliated in the street less than a day earlier. And somewhere in that building, unseen, someone who claimed to be on Amelia's side was already sending another message, letting Ethan know exactly how much trouble he was really in and exactly how he might still survive it. Because the muddy water on Amelia's coat had dried hours ago, but the storm Ethan had just driven into was only getting started. Sterling Global Capital didn't rush decisions worth $10 billion. Even after the moment in the executive suite. Even after Ethan's humiliation became a private joke shared only in glances between Alexander's staff, the due diligence process continued exactly as it would have for any other bidder. That was Amelia's rule. Fair process. No shortcuts. No revenge dressed up as business. But fair process meant looking closely. And when Sterling's investigators looked closely at Coal Infrastructure Group, they found cracks running through the entire foundation. Shell companies, layered ownership structures, assets that had quietly moved from one entity to another during the exact months Ethan's divorce from Amelia had been finalized. On paper, it looked like careful business restructuring. In reality, it looked like a man hiding money from his soon-to-be ex-wife. Amelia sat across from the lead investigator, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Odalise Reyes, and watched the pieces come together on the screen between them. This is the same pattern from the divorce filings. Odalise said, he's still using it. Different companies, same structure. Amelia nodded slowly. It confirmed everything she'd suspected for years, but never had the resources to prove. 5 years ago, she'd been a woman with a broken marriage and no lawyer who could compete with Ethan's. Now she had an entire forensic accounting team and a husband who controlled the deal Ethan needed to survive. It should have felt like enough. But something else was bothering her, something that had nothing to do with old wounds from the divorce. Ethan's lawyers kept responding to concerns before Sterling's team had even finished writing them up. Objections that should have taken his side days to prepare arrived within hours. Confidential details from private internal meetings held behind closed doors with only a handful of trusted people present, kept surfacing in Ethan's legal strategy almost as soon as they were discussed. The old theft explained how Ethan built his empire. It didn't explain how he knew what Sterling Global was thinking today. Someone close to Amelia was still talking. She didn't say this out loud to Alexander right away. She sat with it first, turning it over, feeling something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with pregnancy or exhaustion. She thought about everyone who had access to those meetings. Her assistant, 2 members of the deal team, Alexander's closest advisors, and her brother. Daniel had been present for several of the informal conversations, the ones that happened over dinner, over coffee, in the quiet moments when Amelia let her guard down because she trusted the people in the room. She told herself it couldn't be him. He'd sat beside her through the worst year of her life. He'd been the one constant when everyone else had failed her. But 5 years of running a company had taught Amelia one hard lesson. Trust feels safest right before it costs you the most. So she built a trap. Quiet. Simple. The kind of test that didn't accuse anyone, but would tell her the truth without a single confrontation. She drafted several versions of the same confidential update. A summary of Sterling Global's internal concerns about Coal Infrastructure's finances. Each version contained the same core information, but each one also contained one small, unique detail, a fabricated number, a false meeting time, something invented and specific, planted like a fingerprint. She gave one version to a member of the deal team, one to her assistant, one to an advisor, and one to Daniel. Then she waited. 2 days later, Ethan's legal team filed a response addressing a concern that existed in exactly one version of that update. Daniel's version. Amelia read the filing twice, sitting alone in the back office of Sterling Global's downtown building, the late afternoon light slanting low through the windows. She felt something break quietly inside her chest, a small, specific kind of grief, different from anything Ethan had ever caused. Ethan's betrayal had always felt like something happening to her from the outside. This felt like something collapsing from within. She picked up her phone and called her brother. "Tell me it isn't true." Silence stretched on the line, long enough that she almost hung up. Then Daniel's voice came through, quiet, unsteady. "Amelia, I can explain. Her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. How long? Another silence. It wasn't supposed to go this far. You stood beside me at my wedding. I needed the money, Daniel said, and something in his voice cracked. The sound of a man who had rehearsed excuses for months and still couldn't make them sound like anything other than what they were. Amelia closed her eyes. And I needed my brother. She hung up before he could say anything else. Alexander found her 20 minutes later, sitting alone in the office, her hands folded over her belly, staring at nothing. He didn't need to ask what happened. Odalise had already briefed him on the trap and its results. His first instinct was immediate, sharp, protective. I'm ending Ethan's bid. Tonight. Amelia looked up at him, her eyes red but steady. No, Amelia. Not for me. Not because I'm your wife. Not because I'm carrying your child. She wiped her face, drawing a slow breath. We finished this with evidence, not with anger. Alexander studied her for a long moment, the same way he studied every serious decision, weighing every angle before committing to a direction he couldn't take back. Then he nodded. Then nobody touches the process. A pause, his jaw tightening. And nobody protects Ethan from the truth. While Amelia grieved quietly for the brother she thought she'd known, Ethan was celebrating. Hours before Sterling Global's final decision meeting, confidential material somehow appeared in Ethan's possession. Internal notes suggesting weaknesses in the case being built against him. The bidding process was temporarily suspended while Sterling's legal team reviewed how the material had leaked. Ethan sat in his office on the top floor of Coal Infrastructure Group, feet up on his desk, a glass of expensive scotch in his hand, grinning at the city skyline like he already owned another piece of it. See, he said to his lawyer, a tense, sweating man named Whitfield Marsh. I told you, nobody beats me, not even a billionaire. Whitfield didn't share his confidence. The suspension doesn't mean you've won, Ethan. It means they're reviewing something. They're reviewing their own collapsing case, Ethan said. Amelia thought she could bury me in paperwork. She forgot who taught her how paperwork actually works. He believed in that moment that his hidden advantage had saved him. He believed Amelia's evidence had crumbled under its own weight. He had no idea that the very leak he was celebrating was a final piece of proof that would end him. That night, Daniel called Amelia again. This time, his voice wasn't steady at all. It was frantic, cracking, the voice of a man realizing too late exactly how deep the water around him had risen. Ethan is going to blame everything on me. Amelia's voice was flat, exhausted. You were willing to let him blame everything on me. Daniel had no answer for that. The silence between them said more than anything he could have offered. Please, Amelia, please. She ended the call without another word. In that silence, something in Daniel finally understood what he had refused to see for months. Ethan had never treated him like a partner, never respected him, never valued the risk he was taking by betraying his own sister. Daniel had only ever been a tool, a source, a piece of evidence Ethan intended to use exactly once, then discard. The emergency board meeting convened the next morning in Sterling Global's largest conference room, glass walls looking out over Manhattan under a pale gray sky. Ethan walked in wearing his best suit, freshly shaved, smiling like a man who had already won. As he passed Amelia's seat, he leaned down slightly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Marrying a billionaire doesn't make you powerful. Amelia turned her head and looked at him, calm, unbothered. You're right. Ethan's smile faltered for just a second, uncertain what to make of her agreement. Then he took his seat across the table, confident the meeting would go exactly as he'd planned. It didn't. Ethan's lawyers opened by claiming the entire case against Coal Infrastructure Group was built on fabricated, unreliable information, insisting Sterling Global's due diligence had been compromised by internal errors. Whitfield Marsh spoke for nearly 10 minutes, methodically attacking every piece of financial evidence Odalise Reyes had compiled. Then Amelia stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She explained the trap. Multiple versions of one confidential update, distributed quietly among a small circle of trusted people. Each version containing one unique, fabricated detail. Only one version had ever reached Ethan's legal team. Ethan laughed. leaning back in his chair, glancing around the room like he expected everyone else to laugh with him. That's your evidence? A fake detail you gave your own brother? The room went completely silent, because Amelia had never said the leaked version belonged to Daniel. Ethan realized his mistake half a second too late. His smile disappeared entirely. I never mentioned my brother, Amelia said quietly. The screen behind her lit up. Bank transfers, dated over 18 months, moving steadily from Coal Infrastructure Group into an account belonging to Daniel Carter. Text messages. Confirmation of meeting details Daniel had no legitimate reason to know unless someone had told him directly. And then, finally, a recording, Ethan's own voice unmistakable, instructing Daniel exactly what information to obtain and when to deliver it. Daniel appeared on a video screen at the end of the table, connected remotely with Sterling's investigators standing behind him. His face looked hollow, aged 10 years in a single week. Ethan paid me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I gave him the information. Ethan spun toward the screen, his composure finally shattering completely. You pathetic idiot. Daniel stared back at him, something bitter and broken in his expression. You said Amelia deserved it. That single exchange finished what the financial evidence had started. There was no version of this meeting Ethan could talk his way out of now. He turned toward Alexander, desperation replacing his earlier arrogance. This is personal. Your wife set me up. Alexander had been quiet through most of the meeting, letting the evidence speak for itself. Now he finally leaned forward, his voice calm, measured, and absolutely final. My wife asked me twice not to remove you from this process. Ethan froze. If I had followed my first instinct after seeing what you did to her in the street yesterday morning, Alexander continued, you would never have entered this building today. He closed the folder in front of him. Amelia gave you fairness. A beat of silence stretched through the room. You used it to expose yourself. The independent committee voted within the hour. Coal Infrastructure Group was formally rejected from the $10 billion contract. The evidence of financial misconduct, asset concealment, and corporate espionage was referred to federal investigators for further review. News of the decision moved fast. By that evening, two of Ethan's largest investors had already begun quietly withdrawing their support. By the next morning, his primary lender had called an emergency meeting of his own, demanding immediate repayment terms Ethan had no way to meet. The empire Ethan had built on stolen assets and borrowed confidence began collapsing in exactly the way empires like his always eventually do. Not with an explosion, with a slow, humiliating unraveling that everyone could see coming except the man standing in the middle of it. Days later, rain fell over Manhattan again. Softer this time, the kind that just makes the sidewalk shine instead of flood. Ethan walked out of a glass office building alone. No driver waited for him. No Bentley idled at the curb. His investors had scattered. His lawyers had stopped returning his calls unless it involved their own fees. His phone buzzed constantly now, but the names on the screen belonged to creditors and reporters, not partners or friends. He stood at the edge of the sidewalk, waiting to cross, and a black luxury car approached, slowing as it neared a shallow puddle at the curb. Ethan flinched, stepping back instinctively, bracing for the splash he had once delivered so easily to someone else. The car slowed further. It could have gone straight through. It could have soaked him exactly the way he'd once soaked Amelia, and no one watching would blame the driver for it. It didn't. The window was up, but through the glass, Ethan saw them. Amelia, one hand resting over her pregnant belly, sitting beside Alexander Sterling. For one long moment, their eyes met to the rain-streaked window. Amelia didn't lower the glass. She didn't smile. She didn't say a single word. She didn't need to. The car pulled away smoothly, leaving Ethan standing alone at the edge of the gutter, exactly where he'd once told her she belonged. He splashed muddy water on his pregnant ex-wife because he believed she was still beneath him. But Amelia never needed to drag him down into the mud to prove she'd risen above it. She gave him a fair chance to stand on his own, honestly, without her interference, without her husband's power crushing him out of spite. And when given that chance, Ethan chose the gutter all by himself. Comment if you believe betrayal always leaves evidence behind. And subscribe for more revenge stories where the person everyone underestimated gets the final word.